This is Global Tel Link. You have a prepaid
This
call
call is now
from
being recorded.
Jesse Nava.
an inmate at the Centinela State Prison, Centinela, California. This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded. You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. To accept this call, say or dial 5 now. Thank you for using Global Tel Link.
Hello, Jesse.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for calling. I want to welcome you to my podcast. You have a collect call from, and would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jesse Nava. I'm 43 years old. I was raised in the city of Indio in the desert, a small place in the Coachella Valley. A lot of people know more or less the outskirts, Palm Springs, that area. I've been incarcerated for the last 22 years for a murder I committed as a juvenile. For about the first 19 years of my incarceration, I was wilding out and acting like the same child that committed that murder at 17. And, over the last 3 years, I began transforming and rebuilding my life, and I love who I am today, and I'm excited about where I'll be tomorrow. That's pretty much it.
Thank you, Jesse. I want to start off by going back to your early childhood, or you know what? Let's go back to where does your family originally come from?
So most of my family was from Texas. We're like second, third generation Mexican Americans. My abuelita and them, they were from Nuevo Leon, but from my abuelita up, everybody was born in Texas, and everybody migrated over here from Texas to Indio. So we've been here in the Coachella Valley for at least like 45, 50 years, you know.
Early childhood, like what's your earliest memory that you have as a child?
My earliest memory as a child. To be honest with you, my earliest memory as a child is actually the day that the CPS was actually raiding my house and taking me and my siblings away from my biological parents, and basically taking my parents to jail, and CPS and the sheriffs were there taking us away, and ultimately we were taken to foster care that day. I remember my grandmother being there because she's actually the one. My dad's mom's actually the one that sent the cops and CPS over there to get us. And I remember her being there and feeding us, and that's probably like the earliest memory that I can remember. I have vague memories before that, but not complete memories, you know. I was about 3 years old at that time. This is about like in 1983, around that time.
Okay, so early on, there was issues within the household.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I was born on drugs to two drug addict parents. I was the second of the youngest of 7 siblings. My mom had 2 kids prior to my dad and 5 kids with my dad, and they were both drug addicts. And like I said, I was born on drugs, premature. Was in the hospital for about 4 months, underweight. Ultimately, because my mom actually gave birth to me in the house and actually took us to the hospital. And back then in the 80s, like to this day age, she would have lost her kids that day. You know what I mean? But this is in the early. I was born in 1980, so it was a long time ago. But for some reason, they ended up giving me back to my parents, and I stayed with them for about 3 years, and then my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, ultimately reported my parents for child neglect and abuse, and ultimately we were taken away, put in foster care for a little bit before my grandmother ended up adopting me and my sister, and the rest of my siblings ended up going into CPS and being adopted out.
Once your grandma adopted you, did your life change, or did you notice anything different from the difference between living with your parents and living with your grandmother?
I think honestly, by the time my grandmother had gotten a hold of me, I was such a dysfunctional, hurt, angry, emotional child. Because the earliest years of your life, the first few years of your life, those are the most critical to a child's development. So because I was extremely neglected, abused, starved, I didn't have even the basic nourishments, the basic nurturing from parents. By that point in time, by the time my grandmother got me, I was basically just an angry, hurt child, and I was pretty much out of control already. So by the time my grandmother got me, I was more too much for her to handle, honestly. But I can say this: I did notice a difference, because it was like basically I'm eating when I want now. There was a lot of love there, but I think like I said, my mom, because she ended up adopting me, so I call her my mother. She was out of her league.
And what happened to your parents once CPS picked you up? Do you know what happened to your parents?
Yeah, both my parents went to prison, and my mother ended up getting out. My biological mother, Brenda, she ended up getting out, and she basically went back to doing whatever she was doing. My dad would get out, and he'd pop in and out of the house because I was living with his mother, so I'd see him, from time to time. Yeah, pretty much till probably like 88 or 89, he ended up getting out of prison. He ended up getting caught messing with the correctional officer right here in CRC at a prison that he was in. And so she ended up getting fired, but he ended up paroling to her house. So I went to go live with him like around the age 8 or 9. And yeah, so I basically would see my dad off and on throughout the...
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
But there was no real relationship, and of course he was still on drugs and messing around, so he would just pop in and out. My grandmother wasn't having none of the drugs or anything at the house, so she basically sent him on his way.
If your grandmother was your guardian, or she had custody of you, why is it that you ended up moving in with your dad?
Well, but like I said, by the time I had gotten to a semi-stable home with my grandmother, I was already so emotionally unstable, because again, the only way I knew how to communicate was through screaming and crying and throwing fits, and I had all these emotional impulses that followed me into school, So by the time I got to kindergarten, when my grandmother was dropping me off at school, from the time she adopted me at 3 years old, so I started school at 5 years old, she was the only constant that I had. She was the only stability that I'd ever had in my life. So I had an unhealthy attachment to her. So by the time she dropped me off at school, when kindergarten rolls around, I felt like, okay, here we go again. And as much dysfunction was taking place at my home with my biological parents, that was the only family I knew. So when we did get taken away that day and we did get split up, there was that little bit of a abandonment, and there was a little bit of that, like confusion that's going on in a child's mind, like, well, why am I not going with my parents? So when I'm getting dropped off in kindergarten from my grandmother, I'm starting to experience that same fear and that same confusion with, like, well, hold on, why are you leaving me here? Because I had never been away from her for the last 2 years since I had been in her custody. She basically, she spoiled me. She spoiled me because she seen what I had been going through, because I'm the only one of the boys that went with her. Me and my sister, the rest of the kids all got split up because they wouldn't let her have a...
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
So when I got to school, from the onset of starting school, I was already out of control in kindergarten, because I of course I was scared. I was reacting, impulsively. I was flipping out, screaming and crying, and it wasn't, all kids are going to go through that when they're getting dropped off at school, but there was already, like I said, an unhealthy attachment to my grandmother, to the point that it wasn't, usually it'll pass, and it didn't pass right away. So what I started to learn was, if I kept acting out, they would call her back and just have her pick me up and take me. So I created that belief that, well, if I act out, then, it generated that belief inside me that if I act out, then I can get my grandma back, then she'll come pick me up and I don't have to stay here, And so that was like the beginning of my rebellious behavior, like in a sense, looking back now, I understand that was the beginning of a manipulation tactic,
And once you ended up back with your dad, how was it? How was it living with your dad and his correctional officer girlfriend, I'm assuming?
That went on, like I said, about the getting dropped off at kindergarten. So basically, I started getting in a lot of trouble all the way from kindergarten all the way to third grade. So like about second, third grade, my mom asked me, my grandmother asked me, she's like, hey, your dad's getting out of prison. He has a girlfriend. She has a house. They have everything, like, you want to try going to live with him, it sounds like it's going to be a good thing. She was a correctional officer, and just try it out, because again, she was trying to work, but she couldn't leave work and try to come, deal with me at the school and all that stuff. So ultimately she was just like, look, just do it for me. Try go living with your dad. If it doesn't work out, then I'll bring you back, And so that's how I ended up at my dad's house. She was basically trying to, give herself a break from dealing with all the stuff she had been dealing with me in school over the last few years, from kindergarten all the way to second grade. And so when I went over there to live with them, at first everything was all good. It seemed cool. Like I was just happy to be there with my dad, and because I had been living with my grandmother, and there was no real male role models or anything like that. And it's just a natural instinct for a child to want to have a father. You know what I mean? So looking back, I can remember seeing other kids, with their dad, and being like, oh, so when she asked me like, do you want to go live with your dad? I was like, you know what? Yeah, cool. And so I went over there, and everything, started off cool, started off normal. They set the ground rules, and mind you, my dad was a convict. You know what I mean? So of course, you can only imagine what kind of ground rules was. Basically, I remember getting there and him basically saying like, look, the only rules we have here is, we don't steal, we don't rat, and we don't disrespect women. And I remember the first conversation he had when we got there, when I got to the house, and I'm like, all right, whatever, like I'm a kid, so I was 8 years old, so I didn't really know the difference, And things kind of went cool, for a few months everything went all right, and then my dad started getting back into drugs again and started doing whatever he was doing. He started fighting a lot with his old lady, and things just started taking place, and he started becoming abusive. He started whooping my ass. I attacked my bus driver one time in I believe it was third grade, and they had to call the sheriff to come bring me to the house. And so as soon as the sheriff left, my dad ended up socking me like a man, and he ended up, basically telling me like, look, you little motherfucker, you ever bring the cops to my house again, I'm gonna beat the shit out of you, And he's like, I'm on parole, and of course they had weed, and because him and that correctional officer chick, they used to smoke weed together and stuff right there. But my dad ended up getting back into hard drugs. She didn't use hard drugs, and ultimately that's what ended up tearing their relationship apart, because he got back into hard drugs. And around that time, he ended up bringing my oldest brother, which was my biological mother's first son. He was 18 at the time. He ended up bringing him, Mike, over there to go live with us too, because he considered my dad his dad too, And so that only lasted about, I don't know, I'd say probably about 6 months. And then again, like I said, he got back into drugs. He started getting violent a lot. So ultimately, I ended up calling my grandmother and having her pick me up,
And at what age was that you went back with your grandma?
Probably the same year. So I was around 9 years old, about 9 years old when I only went over there for about 6 months. It only lasted for about 6 months.
And during this time, were you going to school?
Yes, yeah. I was going to elementary school over there where my dad, where I was living with my dad. We had been moving all over from like the age of 6 to about the age of 8 or 9. I lived in like 5 or 6 different places,
As you got older, what kind of issues did you start having, or what kind of were you getting in trouble in school, or how were you doing in school?
In school, as far as like academically, I was struggling academically because, like I said, I had I had the attention span of a squirrel, So it basically
You have 60 seconds remaining.
I wasn't doing too well in school, So for me, it was just basically as soon as something got hard, I'd end up finding some reason to get in trouble or get kicked out of class, and that's kind of what my mom was dealing with while she was sending me to my dad's, because it was just like I wouldn't apply myself in any way, shape, or form because I didn't really think that I could. I was playing stupid, So, and as a result of acting out and playing dumb in school, you get other people making fun of you and rejecting and stuff like that. So ultimately, because my feelings would be hurt, I'd ultimately become violent with other students, because essentially I was basically, how do you say it? I was basically isolating myself because of the way I was acting,
And there is this time. Did you have any friends in school that you had similar stories with, or you shared?
Well, in the beginning.